Welcome to the vaccination station. My name is Dave, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Jessica Steier.
Yes, hello. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Dr. Jessica Steier and Dr. Andrea Love. And they run the Unbiased Science podcast. So let's start by getting to know you. Can you both tell me 3 things about yourselves that you think the audience would find interesting?
Sure. Andrea, can I jump in or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I haven't yet told you, but I'm a public health scientist and an applied biostatistician, but I guess just quickly, I'll say that my interests have evolved quite a bit over time. I considered many other fields. I studied to take the MCAT. I never actually took it. I applied to law school. I actually got in. I did a few years of bench research, preclinical research, but ultimately population health stuck. And we'll talk more about that perhaps later. 2, I'd say that in addition to co-hosting the Unbiased Science podcast, I'm a mother of 2 young children, a 2.5-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son, and a whole host of fur babies, who I'm hoping will behave themselves, 3 dogs and 2 cats. And I'm also CEO of Vital Statistics Consulting, which is a public health consultancy specializing in advanced data analytics. And the last thing I'll say is that I'm in all these mom groups on social media, and I have a lot to say about that. It's actually been the inspiration for quite a few of our podcast episodes, but I've been thrown out of some mom groups for being too aggressively pro-vaccine and pro-science, and I've been accused of weaponizing my credentials. So those are my 3 fun facts.
All right, how to follow that. So, the first thing, obviously we'll talk a little bit more about my background, but I'm an immunologist and microbiologist. And I think maybe the most interesting thing is that I've been really fascinated with critters and disease since I was a very small child. I used to collect bugs in the woods where I grew up in Eastern Connecticut and catalog them. But when I was about 10 years old, I started the habit of carrying around the medical textbook, The Physician's Guide to Arthropods of Medical Importance. And I would read passages to whoever would sit still and listen to me tell them about some new, insect vector that transmits some disease or eats their flesh while they're sleeping. So, we kind of knew where I was going at an early age. I think the next thing that people are always surprised to hear is that I'm actually very introverted. I have actually social anxiety disorder. But because of my passion for science communication and really an understanding of the need to convey science to the general public, I've really been forced to kind of stretch outside my comfort zone and be a little bit more extroverted. I'm used to hanging in a lab and minding my business. So it's been a journey there. And the last thing is, you can probably see, I have a large collection of medals behind me. I am a marathoner and an ultra marathoner. I was actually slated to run the Berlin Marathon this year. And of course, all the races got postponed because of COVID. So I'm hoping that with the vaccine in hand, we may be able to make that trip to Europe next summer. So.
Well, that's really terrific. Thank you both for that terrific introduction. I'm an introvert as well, so I know exactly where you're coming from. Let's move on then to your qualifications. Where did you both study, and what are your qualifications exactly?
Andrea, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So I completed my undergraduate studies at Stony Brook University, and I have a bachelor's in science and biology with a focus in biochemistry. And then I went on to complete my PhD in microbiology and immunology at New York Medical College.
She's a real dummy, Dave. Like Andrea, I also completed my undergraduate studies at Stony Brook University. That's actually where we met. I graduated with a bachelor's in health science and a minor in biology. And I went on to get my master's in public health, also at Stony Brook, with a focus in evaluative science. And then I went on to get my doctorate in public health with an emphasis in health policy from the City University of New York Graduate Center.
Another dummy over there.
So your fields of expertise then are immunology and
public health.
I guess, public health. Okay. But there's data analytics in there as well.
Yeah, so public health is really a very general term. And then within public health, you can specialize. My focus has been on applied biostatistics, applied statistics. Yeah. With just a sprinkling of epidemiology.
How did you first become interested in science as a career?
Andrea?
You know, for me, I think there was a little bit of a nature versus nurture here going on. You know, I clearly had an affinity to the sciences when I was a little kid. I was very curious. I grew up in kind of this borderline rural town, so I was always exploring in the woods. I actually happened to get Giardia probably a half dozen times as a child. So I was kind of firsthand in the microbiology, but it really kind of evolved when I was in high school. So in 11th grade, I took a microbiology class with my previous advanced biology teacher, and he was just a fantastic teacher, fantastic mentor. And this microbiology class, although it was high school level, we were doing a lot of, aseptic technique and skills that you would do ultimately in undergraduate or in college. And that kind of spurred my interest in continuing on with that specific subset of science. I did an independent study with him my 12th grade year, right before I went to college. So I had him for 3 years in a row. And that was actually an epidemiological study looking at bacterial meningitis and a cost benefit analysis for mandatory vaccination for college kids. Because of course we didn't have lab equipment available to do a really in-depth microbiology research, but that kind of really directed my goals. I wrote my college applications essay about how I was going to get my PhD in microbiology and immunology, and I was going to study infectious diseases, and pretty much follow that to a T up to this point.
So for me, I always knew I gravitated toward healthcare. Originally, I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian, combined love of healthcare and animals. But the clinical stuff really never stuck. I hated all of my, I tell this to Andrea all the time, I hated my biology coursework or chemistry. I hated all of that stuff. I liked the math side of things. I always loved statistics, my calculus courses, all that. So for me, public health and specifically biostatistics was this perfect combination of healthcare and math. And then also my father suffered with from advanced emphysema for many years. And so I watched him struggle, and that got me really passionate about public health and in particular preventing chronic diseases. And so again, public health was that outlet for me.
What advice would you give to anyone who's considering a career in science?
Jess, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say, I have so many things to say, but it's not like first of all, a scientist, that's such a general term. And I think Andrea and I are evidence of that. We always say Andrea's really studying science at the micro level. I'm studying science at the macro population health level. So, it can evolve just, as it did for me. I sort of had this general interest and then refined that over time. So it's not like you just wake up knowing exactly what you want to do. It's really an evolution. And then the next thing I'd say is that something I've realized, and for me, the pandemic has really underscored this. We always say science isn't finished until it's communicated. So it's great that you pour all of this time and energy into actually doing science, but really the value is communicating that, and not just within the scientific community, but to the general public. So that's something that's really was the impetus behind Unbiased Science, and something that we're both very passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of the things Jess said. I think for me, so like I've gone to a lot of elementary K through 12 schools to be guest speakers about, you know, being a scientist or being in science. And a lot of the kids, even in this day and age, are floored that a young woman, you know, is a scientist. And so I think, you know, part of it is really dispelling these misconceptions or preconceived notions of what a scientist is. You know, as Jess mentioned, there's a whole gamut of different fields. You know, you could be a biostatistician, you could do mathematical modeling, you could be a bench scientist, you could be, you know, in the field. I mean, and there's a whole array of different types of science, botany, you know, zoology, microbiology, whatever the case happens to be. So, you know, I think it's really just if you have an interest in the natural world or answering the unanswered questions, that's really a good fit for a career in the sciences, because that's ultimately what the scientific method is trying to design questions, you know, that can be answered through a series of experimentation.
Jessica, earlier you said science isn't finished until it's communicated. That's an absolute zinger, and I can virtually guarantee it's going to end up on one of my infographics at some point. But can you unpack it a little more for the audience? Explain exactly what you mean by it. Why isn't science complete until it's communicated? And what do you mean by communicated?
Yeah, I mean, oh my goodness, I could go on and on about this. I think maybe if I could start with how rampant pseudoscience is, and it seems like, you know, especially now with social media and as I mentioned, these mom groups, it's fascinating to me that people are so likely to believe these completely unfounded, non-evidence-based, ridiculous conspiracy theories, and yet we have all this huge body of evidence, all this data that we've worked as scientists to amass. And the problem is that we can't go from the science to, you know, we're not properly translating the science for the layperson. I think that's what it boils down to for me. You know, when you have these statistics, these, you know, fancy terminology and chemicals that, you know, we're referencing in these scientific journals and manuscripts, the layperson doesn't know how to unpack those things. They don't know what that means. So I think it's on us as scientists to, as I keep saying, you know, to unpack those things, to translate them in a way that's digestible for the general public. And I think that's the only way we can combat this real, I don't even know, this epidemic of pseudoscience. Andrea, I get so passionate about this. I'm worried I'm not making sense.
No, absolutely. And I want to give Sir Mark Walport a hat tip. He was the first one that stated that phrase, science is not finished till it's communicated. But ultimately, you know, the issue that I've seen, you know, ultimately as a trained bench scientist is we all sit in these very, very tight niches of science, right? Your graduate research is this little particulate of a broader field of research, and you have a really broad overview of, you know, all the concepts. You're an expert in the field, but you know more about this protein or this microbe or this pathway or whatever the case happens to be. And you get so stuck in the nitty gritty, or scientists do generally, that they forget the forest for the trees, right? So they forget this big picture. And even when we communicate, it's such at this technical level that many of the most brilliant scientists can't have a conversation with the general population and convey these really, really important concepts or fundamentals, because they're so in that bubble of, you know, high intellect, academia, whatever the case happens to be. And so, you know, I was very fortunate in my training to have a lot of practice teaching, tutoring, guest speaking with younger kids, as well as speaking at conferences, both internally and externally, to get comfortable with explaining things for an audience that might not be familiar with what you're talking about. And I think that really needs to be a heavy emphasis. Ultimately, I think anybody in a career in science should be taking science communication courses.
Totally agree. And if I could just add one more thing, context matters so much, and science is nuanced. And so, Andrea and I, we keep talking about these clickbait headlines. The media, who, they're not trained to interpret science, they'll pick up on little tidbits from a study without realizing, okay, what's the context? What groups were studied? What's the sample size? Is this generalizable? What are the limitations of the research? And so that's something that we are really up against right now, and something that, the whole goal of our podcast has been to translate science, and we've found that we've had 4 of our last episodes have been dedicated to dispelling myths and these pseudoscientific crazy conspiracy theories that are being propagated by the media. So yeah.
No, thank you. You've both explained that very well, and you've really highlighted the tension between the information and the knowledge that's held by scientists and the gulf in comprehension from the side of the average layperson. And the tension that arises there, of course, is that the scientist explains things in the terms that the scientist understands, whereas the layperson needs it, simplified a great deal or clarified or even just a huge amount of context provided before any of this makes sense. And when the media gets involved, the media is less interested in accurate communication, I would say, and more interested in attention, because that's what drives clicks and readership.
Absolutely.
So of course, as you say, the media will grab a headline. Scientists will say, "Oh, it appears that SARS-CoV-2 has begun to mutate into a different strain."
Don't even get me started on that one.
But by that, what we actually mean is, and the media goes, "That's fine. We've heard enough. Dangerous new strain has been unleashed. Blah blah blah. Watch out. All your kids are gonna die." Blah blah blah. And the scientists go, "We just found a new protein.
Right.
And there's no chance once the genie's out of the bottle.
You can't.
There's no
can't
way
put it
you
back
can
in. It's this constant firefighting where one single sensationalized headline or one retracted paper is decades of refutations, because we have to put in all of this extra work to walk it back.
Shout out to good old Andy Wakefield, right, Andrea?
And of course, the irony is that when scientists do come in and provide the clarification, the public goes, "Oh yeah, this sounds a bit sus." What are they trying to cover up here?
Exactly.
So yeah, there is that tension. Scientists desperately want to communicate what they've learned, but they have to do it to an audience that lacks the background, the context, the scientific expertise, and the problem is that, one, the public isn't actually trained to hear and understand what they're being told, and two, the scientists typically aren't trained to communicate it. And this is where I think one of you mentioned science communication training. That seems to be a critical point. I would say the media needs this as well. In recent years, I've noticed that some media outlets are actually starting to specialize. They're getting a particular person to be their sort of science journalist, and that person is typically given at least some kind of training in how to speak to scientists. When I started creating this podcast, I actually looked up tips on how to interview scientists, and I found some sort of media training websites that said, these are the questions you should be asking the scientists. Ask them about their research, ask them about practical applications, and ask them to communicate stuff, in simple terms. Ask them to use analogies to explain their research, because that's an excellent way to communicate complex ideas in a simple way. So I've sort of tried to model my podcast on that kind of approach, which I think is much more helpful. Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed is that there is actually one group of people who are typically really good at communicating ideas, and they are ironically the people we trust least, and that is politicians. Now, the average politician does receive media training, a lot of it, and necessarily they have to be on message. They've got talking points. Everything is carefully stage managed, and yeah, there's a lot of artificiality in there. But when it comes to getting across policy ideas or basic government positions on a certain issue, it works and it's solid, and they are trained in how to answer questions in a way that removes ambiguity and makes the position clear. Or if the government's in trouble, they're trained to answer in a way that adds ambiguity and muddies it as much as possible. But the bottom line is they have media training and they're actually pretty good communicators. And I think it's very frustrating that the politicians that we trust the least have got the best media training to communicate their ideas, which they're actually very good at doing, whereas the scientists who we should be listening to more of haven't actually been given that. And that, I think, is going to be an ongoing problem. Plus, of course, the tension between the scientists and the media, where the scientists say, well, all we said to you was such and such, and you completely distorted it into some weird big thing because you wanted your attention-grabbing headlines. Mm-hmm. So there's a three-way problem between the intended audience, which is the public, the media and their motivations and goals, and then the scientists who want to get the information out but aren't always sure about how to do that. And I think it's ironic that the people who are best trained in media communication are actually the politicians, when ideally it should be the scientists, because this has a direct bearing, obviously, on the way health intersects with public policy. The average person on the street goes, why are politicians making decisions about my health? Now, a smart politician will say, well, we're not making decisions in isolation. We have committees who talk to experts, and we have conferences that we hold to bring in the scientists and the doctors to advise us, and we've got medical experts, in the civil service who advise us and this kind of thing. But that's not always very communicated very well. It tends to be all about, our government is performing very well and under tremendous pressure, and despite the challenges of this pandemic, we're going very well, and look at our approval ratings and look how safe we're keeping you. And, we really think we've done so much better than the opposition would have done. And it tends to devolve in a lot of political point scoring. What they really should be doing is pushing the professionals and those with the scientific and medical expertise out the front, say, these are the people who guide our decisions. Your decisions about public health are not being simply made by politicians. They are being directed by people who are specially trained, highly trained in these fields. And that's who's actually who's driving the policy. Do you think that that's a fair summary of the situation?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges, and a lot of that is linked to who has access to those training tools, right? To these skill sets that, really rely on effective communication. And I think, we do need to have more of this kind of bridging the gap between, politics and ultimately government, which is going to dictate and organize healthcare, health disparities, public health policy. I mean, we're seeing this in the midst of this pandemic and the handling of the pandemic, and, country by country variability in handling of the pandemic. And, a lot of it ultimately boils down to, mismatching communication, I think.
And I don't know what the climate is in Australia, but here in the U.S., I mean, Andrea and I get accused on a daily basis of having some ulterior motive or being, shills for pharma. There's this real distrust of science that is just something that we're up against. So it's, first we need to somehow reestablish trust, and then we need to also figure out how to communicate properly. And as we all just kind of said at the beginning of this chat, we're all introverts. I think that people who tend to gravitate towards science maybe aren't naturally the best communicators, so it might take a little bit of work.
Yeah, I would say off the cuff, there's very few extroverted scientists that I could really think of. One science communicator who has always greatly impressed me, and she was probably the scientist who got me interested in following science communication in the first place, is Dr. Anna Zachrisson, who's in Europe. She's a Swedish scientist currently resident in Germany, I believe, and she runs a Facebook page called Dr. Anna's Imaginarium, and she's a really interesting, excited, passionate person who delivers her ideas very clearly and is also great to talk to. She was the first person I interviewed on this podcast, and she's extremely personable. She's got a great sense of humor, and she communicates extremely well. And she's sort of the kind of exemplar that I would hold up as what people should be looking for in a science communicator. And of course, there's plenty of other people who are very good as well. I would say Dr. Peter Hotez, for example, as well. If you've seen him on the media at any point, he's done a huge amount of work. Dr. Fauci also, I think, does a great job in communicating some very difficult and challenging facts and statistics and updates about the current situation in the US. And despite the phenomenal pressure he must be under, I think he does a quite outstanding job. So perhaps you can both tell me about any recent research that you've done and what the real life applications are.
Sure, I could jump in. So my firm, Vital Statistics, we are working with a very large health system in New York, and we did a sero survey for them. So antibody research, so their employees volunteered to have their blood drawn and tested for antibodies to COVID-19. And so we just wrapped, we collected all the data, we've begun analysis. Some interesting preliminary findings are that quite a few people actually had antibodies to COVID and really had, didn't report any symptoms, never knew that they were exposed. And so I think for me, this really underscores how important asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic spread is. We can be highly contagious and spreading this virus even without knowing that we've had it or been exposed. So that's just one example of something that I think is pretty relevant.
Definitely relevant. Something that I recently wrapped on, I've been working the last couple of years on a immunotherapy research project. We're using CAR T. So CAR T are a particular type of T cells that have been engineered to target traditionally cancer, but also other disease states. And in this instance, we've been studying CAR T in the context of immunotherapy or an HIV infection. And we recently published a paper in Journal of Immunological Methods this past September. But basically, the overarching goal of this project was to identify methods to screen and identify cell therapy options for HIV infection. So a lot of these treatments that we're hearing about for cancer, this CAR T therapy, there's some very promising information that we may even be able to use it to treat these chronic or latent viral infections like HIV and possibly other disease states as well.
Andrea, you look like a proud mama right now.
I could talk immunotherapy all day long.
So how did you both get into science communication?
So, Andrea, did you?
No. I mean, I was just going to say, so I feel like, my kind of early forays into science communication were really, in the scope of teaching and tutoring. So when I was an undergraduate, I tutored and was a TA for a lot of classes for undergrads. I TA'd organic chemistry lab. I know, just hated orgo, but I liked it so much I went back for more. And then I actually served as an academic tutor for all the student athletes at Stony Brook. So something that's really challenging for college athletes is that they're often away for games when their important classes are. So they spend a lot of time playing catch up and needing to make up exams, make up lab reports, make up all sorts of things. So I actually worked, in addition to working in the lab and taking my own classes, I worked as a tutor for the Student Athlete Development Center to make sure all these kids were able to catch up on their classes, help them prep for tests. I did a lot of test prep, exam study sessions, things like that. And it really, I'd go to a session and I'd hear from one of the football players who was kind of struggling to pass this math class. And he would come and tell me he got a B+ on his exam. And I just felt like, I was doing something right in that I was taking my knowledge base and giving it to him in a way that he could understand and digest. And I think it really hit home where there was this one guy I was working with, and he had never been taught how to do long division by hand. He had gone through from childhood, school by school, and every single time, he had a question about it, the teacher would tell him, use your calculator, or it just works this way. He never really understood why 3/4 equaled 0.75. And when we got to the type of math where you actually needed that foundational knowledge, he was really struggling. And, there's this one moment where it clicked and he got it, and it just made his life simpler. Right. And I think from there, I really started to understand the importance of being able to translate complex topics for people that are not familiar with them. And, with Jess and I, with this podcast, it evolved because we shared this similar frustration and, the dearth of access to digestible science for the general public. And I'll let Jess kind of jump in there.
Yeah. So, yes, lots to say about this. Prior to getting into health analytics consulting, I was actually a professor at a university in New York teaching research methodology, epidemiology, biostatistics to physician assistant students, so to future clinicians. And something that really struck me was that I think people just assume that if you're a doctor or a PA or a clinician, a nurse, that you understand science. And we have the utmost respect for clinicians. I just want to say that, but they're not by default scientists. So it was really interesting. There was this, I don't know, at first the clinicians or clinician students, I should say, were very resistant to learning the research methodology. But then once I gave that foundation, they all had this aha moment of, oh, wow, that's why we're designing research. Oh, there's something called a counterfactual. We're trying to compare these two groups. Why are we trying to compare? Anyway, so that was my aha moment. It was a fantastic experience for me. I absolutely love teaching. And then, as Andrea said, there was also this sort of sense of like necessity, like this duty that I had as a scientist. I know I've said it already, but like seeing what's been swirling on social media, the impact that that's had on, I don't know, supersonic pseudoscience. Andrea and I kept in touch over the past decade. We're messaging each other and saying, we have to do something. Even before the pandemic, it was actually vaccines that got us going. In every mom group, at least 10 times a day, oh, is there a pediatrician who doesn't force vaccines on you? And, talking about, I can't, I get very upset when I talk about it. And so Andrea and I kept in touch and we said, we have to spread the science. We have to talk to these people, these lay people, and have them understand, really demystify the science and teach them that just because something has a chemical name, that doesn't automatically make it bad, so I don't know if that made sense, but that was my sort of journey.
No, that's really great from both of you. Thank you. And it leads nicely to my next question, which is, how has social media affected the way you communicate your knowledge and ideas? Because social media at first glance seems to be an ideal platform for communication, and yet some of these platforms are surprisingly limited. Twitter, for example, each post has a very strict word limit, so you end up having to say to people at the start, thread, and then there's now 20
Right.
posts where you try to communicate as concisely as possible, and you still end up with 20 posts, and some people just will take a look and go, oh, first post, second post, yeah, I'm not going to read the rest of that. and they walk
Right.
away. Similar thing in Facebook, although the word limit is incredibly generous. No one wants to wade through a huge wall of text. Videos and infographics work best on Facebook, and probably on Twitter as well, unless you can really just shoot out those nice little bite-sized chunks of information that can be squeezed into a single post. So social media is very liberating, but it does have some awkward restrictions that tend to sort of force you to use one method or another, depending on what platform you're on. So how has that affected the way you communicate?
I'm sorry, go on.
No, you go. You go.
I was going to say social media is a total double-edged sword. It's like the source of this, it provides a platform for all this pseudoscience to sort of at rapid speed be transmitted and consumed, but it's also this really incredible platform for us to spread science. So as you said, there are all these restrictions, character limits, word limits. At least daily, Andrea and I are cursing, like, how do we shorten this post? Because it is really difficult to truncate these studies that have maybe taken place over years, to sort of distill that down into a paragraph or two. So that's been really challenging. And to your point, it's funny that you say, videos, that's a really great way to effectively communicate. Andrea and I, we're doing this podcast in our non-existent spare time, is what we always say. We both work full time, family life, home life. And so it's so hard for us to carve out time to, shower and brush our hair to get camera ready and actually communicate. But that does seem to be the most effective modality, especially in real time when people are able to ask questions and you can interface with them and answer, in a live setting. But Andrea, sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, I mean, I was gonna, kind of reiterate that, we know that misinformation spreads 6 times faster than fact. And that is a challenge. I have a love-hate relationship with social media. It's a necessary evil in the current era that we're in. Even when you look at marketing is all digital. Everything is digital now. So, we publish in peer-reviewed scientific journals, but that's not what the everyday person is reading. They're reading, and most people are consuming their news on social media. They're not going to news sources anymore, right? They're seeing a repost and maybe it's misinterpreted there, and originally it was misinterpreted. And so you have these multiple levels of misinterpretation. And then it's this game of telephone where it gets magnified. And I feel like a lot of times instead of putting out, information, we're putting out fires. We're doing a lot of firefighting. We're doing a lot of, oh man, can you believe that they posted this? Now we have to go spend 2 hours creating content to debunk it. Which, unfortunately is necessary these days, right? We need to ensure that people continue all these public health mitigation measures. We need to ensure that people get the vaccine when it's available. And so it requires this counterattack. And we're almost constantly on alert, right? We have to, keep our hand to the pulse of what's going on social media. And we have a plan of attack pretty much daily. Okay, we're going to roll out this, we're going to roll out this, we're going to prep for this, we're going to make sure we address this. Because, it's a snowball effect, right? Once something like that takes root, people need to respond almost instantaneously to debunk or clarify something.
Just one final thing, if I may, is that we, as we've discussed, we don't have that communication training. In addition, I feel like I also need graphic design training, and I need, I don't know how to create, these posts that are going to, how do I grab someone's attention? We all know that people don't have a whole lot of attention, the attention span's not great these days. So how are we going to capture that attention and do so effectively and effectively communicate the science? So it's like, there are so many different hats you have to wear as a scientific communicator. It's very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, certainly running my own Facebook page, I've had to learn a lot of stuff along the way as I go. I mean, to create my infographics, I found a really good site called canva.com, where there's a huge range of templates that you can use to create your own infographics, and you can mix and match them and upload your own media and that kind of stuff, which is how I create all the stuff for the vaccination station. But it has been a real learning curve, and if it's challenging for me, someone who doesn't even have a scientific background, then for someone who has the scientific background and has a huge amount of information they really want to convey, then I can imagine just how challenging it is for you guys, because you want to be able to get across the essentials in a way that's coherent, but not dumbed down to the point where it's actually inaccurate. And that's the danger, obviously, of oversimplifying, so people come away with just sound bites but very little substance behind them, which is, as we've observed earlier, is the big problem with mainstream media miscommunicating science. Everyone I've spoken to on this podcast has said to me, yes, social media is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it gives a tremendous voice for science communicators, whereas on the other hand, it is probably more than anything else the perfect network system for village idiots. And that's pretty much what we see all over Facebook, Twitter, and even some of the crazier ones like Vote and Gab and more recently Parler. And because social media is geared towards pushing people towards their interests via algorithms, echo chambers arise very quickly. And once people are in an echo chamber, they begin to think that represents reality, and they're reluctant to step outside the echo chamber because they're already being told what they want to hear. And that's the other problem. People need to learn that it's not about what you want to hear. Sometimes what you have to hear is actually what you don't want to hear. Reality is complex, reality is big and sophisticated, and reality is very often unpleasant. So the challenge is to confront ourselves with the reality, confront ourselves with scientific facts that may be unsettling, that may strike at deep-rooted prejudices we've had for a long time, or strike at the core of basic assumptions we've had about the universe. Maybe if we're religious, it could present huge challenges for some aspects of our belief system and our general worldview. And even if we're not religious, it might actually present other challenges in terms of ethics or politics. And that, to me, is really the crux of it. People don't like to be challenged. People don't like to feel that their worldview is threatened. So they retreat to safe spaces and echo chambers, when really they should be putting themselves out there and challenging themselves. And I think that's the beauty of science, that it simply presents us with the evidence and the facts and the data insofar as it has been known and understood so far, and it says this is reality, let's talk about it, let's deal with it. And that, I think, is what's so exciting about science communication.
This is such a lovely conversation that we're having, Dave. This is so refreshing to actually speak to someone who gets it and is like-minded. So thank you for this.
You're very welcome. I mean, I'm happy to be, just a regular dad who can represent the man on the street who just comes along and does his best to understand what the scientists are trying to communicate. So it's really, really helpful to have conversations with experts such as yourselves, who can give me your side of the picture and show me what it's like from your perspective, because I can appreciate the frustration that you must face on an ongoing basis. I mean, I'm immensely frustrated with these people, and I'm not even a scientist.
Well, and to have people who don't have the expertise, sort of come at you. There really is this death of expertise. Certainly in the US, I think it's a global issue. I think that social media gives people a platform to feel like they're experts in something, and it's like, no, we really, by definition, are experts. We've trained for years, we've studied, we've worked in the fields. I mean, at some point, I always say, if I have a leaky roof, I'm going to call a roofer. If I have a scientific question, I'm going to consult a scientist. And that's just, I don't know, that's just not happening these days. So we need to take back control.
The analogy that I like to present to anti-vaxxers is, well, you wouldn't ask a plumber to take out your appendix.
There you have.
At some point, even you recognize that expertise and specialization is essential. So all you need to do is broaden that a little bit and realize just how far it applies to science and medicine.